guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to part 2 of our look at the 4th Vice President of the United States, George Clinton. Yes, this is our next Vice Presidential Series installment, of course, taking a look at George Clinton. Part 1, as you guys knew, and I'm sure many of you watched, that went over kind of a little bit about his early life, some of his military background, and then, of course, kind of his rise in the political ranks through his governorship of New York, and then, of course, all the way leading up to him becoming vice president. And now in this part 2, we're going to take a look at his vice presidency, kind of just a couple things he did while he was vice president. And then, not too many, I don't have too many, but a couple fun facts, so to speak. And then, of course, that'll be it. Because George Clinton actually did die while he was in office, while he was vice president. So we're going to learn about that, and we're going to go over that. So we're going to jump right in here and kind of just continue where we left off with part 1. Now, part 1 was about 40 or 45 minutes long, somewhere in that vicinity. Part 2, this may not even be 40 minutes long. We may be wrapping this up within about 25 or 30 minutes. So, like I said, I will put out as much content as I can. I will visit as many locations and fun little sites and historical markers as I can relating to vice presidents. But unfortunately, there's just not much. There really isn't. So I will do the best I can for you guys. Now, one thing I did want to mention with George Clinton, I do have a couple little bonus things at the end of this video, a couple little bonus features. Of course, you're going to see the gravesite of all of these vice presidents because I did visit those. And I'm probably going to, for the most part, put their gravesite at the end of each part 2 video, probably around, I'll probably even put it in, the bonus footage feature. I might show some photos of the grave when I'm talking about their death on the screen. However, their actual, the pictures that I really took at the gravesite, might just leave that for the bonus footage so you guys can really take a better look at it. So there you go. Here we go. We're going to jump right in here with our 4th United States Vice President, George Clinton. Widely respected for his heroism during the war and for his devotion to Republican principles, George Clinton was a candidate who could replace Aaron Burr without alienating New York voters. His age and precarious health were important considerations for Thomas Jefferson, who calculated that in 1808, the 65-year-old hero would be too old to challenge his intended successor, Secretary of State James Madison, for the Republican presidential nomination. But George Clinton had no intention of deferring to Madison in 1808. As a Madison biographer, Ralph Ketchum, has explained, New York Republicans were deeply jealous of the Virginians who had dominated their party's councils since 1792. George Clinton's replacement of Aaron Burr as vice president in 1804 was not so much a reconciliation with the Virginians, he suggests, as a play for better leverage to oust the Virginians in 1808. After the election, George Clinton was all but shunted aside by a president who had no wish to enhance his vice president's stature in the administration or encourage his presidential ambitions. Thomas Jefferson no longer asked George Clinton's advice in making political appointments in New York or elsewhere, or on any other matter of substance, relying instead on the counsel of Madison and Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin. When he felt it necessary to consult Republican legislators, he did so in person or through Gallatin, whose Capitol Hill residence served as the meeting place for the Republican caucus. Now known as the Sewell Belmont House, this building still stands, adjacent to the Hart Senate Office Building. George Clinton also took little part in the social life of the administration. Washington society had a distinctly Southern flavor, and as the vice president confided to Senator Plumer, he found the habits, manners, customs, laws, and country of New England much preferable to the Southern states. A widower for 4 years at the time of his election, George Clinton and his daughter Maria lived frugally with House of Representatives clerk John Beckley and seldom entertained. Even in an administration that consciously avoided ceremony and ostentatious display in favor of the simple, Republican style that shocked foreign visitors and scandalized Federalists, Clinton's parsimony was legendary. Mr. Clinton always comes to the city in his own carriage, Plumer says. He is immensely rich, but lives out at board like a common member. He keeps no table or invites anybody to dine, a style of living unworthy of the second officer in our government. Another senator observed that Mr. Clinton lives snug at his lodgings and keeps aloof from exhibitions. George Clinton's sole function was to preside over the Senate. Nor was he an effective presiding officer. Senator Plumer observed when Clinton assumed the presiding officer's chair on December 16th of 1805 that he seemed altogether unacquainted with the Senate's rules, had a clumsy, awkward way of putting a question, and preserves little or no order. Senator John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts shared Plumer's concern. The Senate's new president was totally ignorant of all the most common forms of proceeding in the Senate. He wrote in his diary, "His judgment is neither quick nor strong, so there was no more dependence upon the correctness of his determination from his understanding than from his experience. A worse choice than Mr. Clinton could scarcely have been made." Clinton's parliamentary skills failed to improve with experience, as Plumer observed a year later. The vice president preserves very little order in the Senate. If he ever had, he certainly has not now the requisite qualifications of a presiding officer. Age has impaired his mental powers. The conversation and noise today in our lobby was greater than I ever suffered when moderator of a town meeting. It prevented us from hearing the arguments of the speaker. He frequently, at least he has more than once, declared bills at the third reading when they had been read but once. Puts questions without any motion being made. Sometimes declared it a vote before any vote has been taken. And sometimes, before one bill is decided, he proceeds to another. From want of authority and attention to order, he has prostrated the dignity of the Senate. His disposition appears good, but he wants mind and nerve. Although Plumer and others attributed the vice president's ineptitude to his advanced age and feeble health, George Clinton's long-standing aversion to councils probably compounded his difficulties. He had little patience with long-winded senators, as a chagrined John Quincy Adams discovered after an extended discourse that was, by his own admission, a very tedious one to all my hearers. The vice president, he concluded, does not love long speeches. Clinton could do little to alleviate his discomfort, given the fact that the Senate's rules permitted extended debate. but on at least one occasion, he asked a special favor, that when we were about to make such, we should give him notice, that he might take the opportunity to warm himself at the fire. Clinton was frequently absent from the Senate, but he apparently summoned the strength to attend when he found a compelling reason to do so. A case in point was his tie-breaking vote to approve the nomination of John Armstrong Jr., a childhood friend and political ally, as a commissioner to Spain. Federalist senators and many of their Republican colleagues vehemently opposed Armstrong's nomination, alleging that he had mishandled claims relating to the ship New Jersey while serving as a minister to France. At issue was Armstrong's finding that the 1800 convention with France indemnified only the original owners of captured vessels, a position he abandoned after Jefferson insisted that insurers should also receive compensation. Senator Samuel Smith of Maryland, a member of Jefferson's own party and the brother of Navy Secretary Robert Smith, so effectively mustered the opposition forces that, by Adams's account, no senator spoke on Armstrong's behalf when the Senate debated his nomination on March 17th of 1806. After Senator John Adair, a Republican from Kentucky, left his seat to avoid voting, the vice president, who had earlier informed Plumer that he had intended not to take his seat in the Senate this session, resolved the resulting 15-15 tied vote in Armstrong's favor. I apprehended, Plumer surmised, that they found it necessary and prevailed on him to attend. Clinton was absent for the remainder of the session. Clinton's only known attempt to influence legislation as vice president occurred in early 1807, when he asked John Quincy Adams to sponsor a bill to compensate settlers who had purchased western Georgia lands from the Yazoo Land Company. In 1795, the Georgia legislature had sold 35 million acres of land to 4 land speculation companies, which resold the properties to other land jobbers and to individual investors before the legislature canceled the sale and ceded the lands to the United States. A commission appointed to effect the transfer to the United States proposed that 5 million acres be earmarked to indemnify innocent parties. I apologize, I was receiving a phone call. See what happens when you do things kind of amateur-like? This time it was not Henry, though. A commission appointed to effect the transfer to the United States proposed that 5 million acres be earmarked to indemnify innocent parties. But Representative John Randolph of Virginia charged that congressional approval of the arrangement would basically allow the fraud a little further. A continuance of the fraud a little further. And he blocked a final settlement. In March of 1806, the Senate passed a bill to compensate the Yazoo settlers, but the House rejected the measure. With sentiment against compensation steadily mounting, the Senate on February 11th of 1807 enacted a bill to prevent settlements on lands ceded to the United States unless authorized by law. The following day, Adams recorded in his diary that the vice president this morning took Adams apart and advised him to ask leave to bring in a bill on behalf of the Yazoo claimants, like that which passed the Senate at the last session, to remove the effect of the bill passed yesterday. George Clinton apparently abandoned the effort after Adams responded that he did not think it would answer any such purpose. George Clinton's always tenuous relationship with Thomas Jefferson became increasingly strained as the president responded to English and French assaults on American shipping with a strategy of diplomatic maneuvering and economic coercion. Clinton viewed the escalating conflict between England and France with alarm. He believed that war with one or both nations was inevitable and became increasingly frustrated with Jefferson's seeming reluctance to arm the nation for battle. The vice president's own state was particularly vulnerable because New York shippers and merchants suffered heavily from British raids. Yet Jefferson's proposed solution of an embargo on foreign trade would have a devastating impact on the state's economy. New York's limited coastal defenses, Clinton feared, would prove painfully inadequate in the event that the president's strategy failed to prevent war. That kind of leads us right up to the election of 1808. The election of 1808 was actually James Madison, who was the Democratic-Republican nominee. He was from Virginia, of course. He was going up against Charles C. Pinckney, who was the Federalist from South Carolina. And James Madison's vice presidential candidate running with him was George Clinton. So the 1808 Democratic-Republican Party ticket was James Madison for president and George Clinton for vice president. And, of course, they won. So Clinton became vice president under both Jefferson and Madison. So here's a little bit more about that. Congress approved the Embargo Act, closing United States ports to foreign trade in December of 1807. When the Republican Congressional Caucus met the following month to select the party's 1808 presidential candidate, the vice president's supporters were conspicuously absent. Clinton knew that the caucus would choose Madison, the architect of Jefferson's foreign policy, as their presidential candidate, but apparently believed that he could win the presidency without the support of the caucus. Our venerable friend, the vice president, Senator Mitchell observed, considers himself as fully entitled to the first place in the nation. Clinton was so self-complacent, Mitchell marveled, that he failed to discern what was as plain as daylight to anybody else, that there was not the remotest probability of his success as president. But George Clinton still commanded a substantial following among disaffected Republicans from the Middle Atlantic states. Because New Yorkers in particular resented Virginia's near monopoly of the presidency since 1789, Madison's campaign managers considered Clinton enough of a threat to suggest him as a possible running mate. Much to Clinton's chagrin, the caucus renominated him to a second term as vice president. His only public response was a letter to DeWitt, subsequently edited for maximum effect and released to the press by the calculating nephew, denying that he had been directly or indirectly consulted on the subject or apprised of the meeting held for the purpose, otherwise than by having accidentally seen a notice. George Clinton neither accepted nor expressly refused the vice presidential nomination, a posture that caused considerable consternation among Republican strategists. When caucus representatives called on him to discuss the matter, his tart, severe, and puzzling reply left them as much in a quandary as ever what to do with their nomination of him. He was, Senator Mitchell theorized, as much a candidate for the presidency as for the vice presidency. As far as Clinton was concerned, he remained a presidential candidate. While he affected the disinterested posture that the early 19th century electoral etiquette demanded of candidates for elective office, his supporters mounted a vigorous attack on Jefferson's foreign policy, warning that Madison, the president's mere organ or mouthpiece, would continue along the same perilous course. But George Clinton, one pamphleter promised voters, would protect you from foreign and domestic foes. Writing under the pseudonym A Citizen of New York, the vice president's son-in-law, Edmund Gannett, promised that Clinton would substitute a dignified plan of neutrality for the hated embargo, turning their candidate's most obvious liability to their advantage. Clintonians portrayed the vice president as a seasoned elder statesman, a repository of experimental knowledge. The tension between Jefferson and his refractory vice president flared into open hostility after Clinton read confidential diplomatic dispatches from London and Paris before an open session of the Senate on February 26th of 1808. The president had transmitted the reports to the Senate with a letter expressly warning that the publication of papers of this description would restrain injuriously the freedom of our foreign correspondence. But as John Quincy Adams recorded, the vice president, not remarking that the first message was marked on the cover, confidential, suffered all the papers to be read without closing the doors. George Clinton claimed that the disclosure was inadvertent, but the dispatches had seemed to affirm his own conviction that war with Great Britain appears inevitable. Much to his embarrassment, the blunder was widely reported in the press. Entering the Senate chamber rather late than usual one morning, Adams witnessed an unusual display of temper. The vice president had been formally complaining of the president for a mistake, which was really his own. The message of the 26th of February was read in public because the vice president, on receiving it, had not noticed the word confidential written on the outside cover. This had been told in the newspapers and commented on as evidence of Mr. Clinton's declining years. He thinks it was designedly done by the president to ensnare him and expose him to derision. This morning he asked Secretary of the Senate Samuel Otis for a certificate that the message was received in Senate without the word confidential, which Otis declining to do. He was much incensed with him and spoke to the Senate in anger, concluding by saying that he thought the executive would have had more magnanimity than to have treated him thus. Support for Clinton's presidential bid steadily eroded as the election approached, and even the most ardent Clintonians realized that their candidate had no chance of winning. Some bowed to the will of the caucus as a matter of course, while the prospect of a Federalist victory eventually drove others into the Madison camp. New England Federalists, energized by their opposition to the embargo, briefly considered endorsing Clinton as their presidential candidate, but ultimately nominated Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina after intelligence reports from New York indicated that the Republicans there were disposed to unite in the abandonment of Clinton. Madison won an easy victory with 122 electoral votes, and Clinton finished a distant third with only 6 electoral votes, a face-saving gesture by sympathetic New York Republicans who cast the state's 13 remaining votes for Madison. The vice presidential contest posed a unique problem for Republican electors. Clinton was still the Republican vice presidential candidate, notwithstanding the fact that, as Senator Wilson Carey Nicholas of Virginia observed, his conduct had alienated him from the Republicans. Although painfully aware that among the warm friends of Mr. Clinton are to be found the bitterest enemies of the administration, they ultimately elected him vice president because they feared that the repudiating the caucus nomination would set a dangerous precedent. If he is not elected, Nicholas argued, there will not in future be any reliance upon such nominations. All confidence will be lost, and there cannot be the necessary concert. As Virginia Republican General Committee Chairman Philip Norborn Nicholas stressed, it would be impossible to reject Clinton without injury to the Republican cause. Clinton left for New York before Congress assembled in the House of Representatives chambers to count the electoral votes on February 8th of 1809, thus avoiding the unpleasant task of proclaiming Madison's election as president and his own re-election as vice president. He did not return in time to witness Madison's inauguration on March 4th, and surviving records do not indicate where or when he took his own oath. In the meantime, his supporters had already joined forces with disaffected Republican senators Samuel Smith of Maryland, William B. Giles of Virginia, and Michael Leib of Pennsylvania in a successful attempt to prevent Madison from nominating Albert Gallatin as Secretary of State. George Clinton opposed Madison's foreign and domestic policies throughout his second vice presidential term, but he lacked the support and the vitality to muster an effective opposition. Still, he dealt the administration a severe blow when he cast the deciding vote in favor of a measure to prevent the recharter of the Bank of the United States. Madison had once opposed Hamilton's proposal to establish a national bank, but by 1811, 20 years of usefulness and public approval had mooted his objections. Treasury Secretary Gallatin considered the bank an essential component of the nation's financial and credit system. But Clinton and other old Republicans still considered the institution an unconstitutional aggrandizement of federal power. The Senate debated Republican Senator William H. Crawford of Georgia's recharter bill at great length before voting on a motion to kill it on February 20th of 1811. George Clinton voted in favor of the motion after the Senate. So there we go, getting another phone call. I apologize. This time it was Henry. So Henry says hello to everyone. This time it was Henry making another guest appearance. He always finds these times to call in. So one of these days I got to patch him in somehow so he can just start talking to me while we're recording here. So let me read that over. The Senate debated Republican Senator William H. Crawford of Georgia's recharter bill at great length before voting on a motion to kill it on February 20th of 1811. George Clinton voted in favor of the motion after the Senate deadlocked by a vote of 17 to 17. His vote did not in itself defeat the bank, since the recharter bill had already failed in the House of Representatives, but this last act of defiance dealt a humiliating blow to the administration and particularly to Gallatin, who observed many years later that nothing can be more injurious to an administration than to have in that office a man in hostility with that administration, as he will always become the most formidable rallying point for the opposition. In a brief and dignified address to the Senate, George Clinton explained his vote, declaring his long-standing conviction that government is not to be strengthened by an assumption of doubtful powers. Could Congress, he asked, create a body, politic and corporate, not constituting, no, what is this? Not constituting, I have no idea why I'm reading it that way. Not constituting a part of the government, nor otherwise responsible to it by forfeiture of charter, and bestow on its members privileges, immunities, and exemptions not recognized by the laws of the states, nor enjoyed by the citizens generally. The power to create corporations is not expressly granted by the Constitution, he reasoned, but if the powers vested in the government shall be found incompetent to the attainment of the objects for which it was instituted, the Constitution happily furnishes the means for remedifying the evil by amendment. Then Senator Henry Clay, a Kentucky Republican, later claimed that he was the author of the vice president's remarks. Long after Clinton's death, but before Clay reversed his own position to become one of the bank's leading advocates during the 1830s, the ever-boastful Clay asserted that the speech was perhaps the thing that had gained the old man more credit than anything else that he ever did. Henry Clay, however, admitted that he had written it under Mr. Clinton's dictation, and he never should think of claiming it as his own composition. George Clinton's February 20th of 1811 speech was his first and last formal address to the Senate. 2 days later, he notified the senators that he would be absent for the remainder of the session. He returned for the opening session of the 12th Congress on November 4th of 1811 and faithfully presided over the Senate throughout the winter. But by the end of March of 1812, he was too ill to continue. President pro tempore William Crawford presided for the remainder of the session, while Clinton's would-be successors engaged in electioneering beyond description for the 1812 vice presidential nomination. On April 12th of 1812, Crawford informed the Senate of the death of our venerable fellow citizen, George Clinton, Vice President of the United States. The following afternoon, a joint delegation from the Senate and the House of Representatives accompanied Clinton's body to the Senate chamber. He was the first person to lie in state in the Capitol for a brief 2-hour period before the funeral procession escorted his remains to the nearby Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. President Madison was among the official mourners, although he and the First Lady held their customary reception at the Executive Mansion the following day. In the Senate chamber, black crepe adorned the presiding officer's chair for the remainder of the session, and each senator wore a black armband for 30 days, from an unfeigned respect for the departed president. Clinton's former rival, Gouverneur Morris, later offered a moving, if brutally frank, tribute to the fallen soldier of the Revolution. Clinton had rendered a lifetime of service to New York and the nation. Morris reminded his audience, but to share in the measure of the administration was not his part. To influence them was not in his power. So there you have it, George Clinton. And just lastly, here just to read again, after the 1808 election, Clinton and his supporters opposed the Madison administration, and Clinton helped block the appointment of Albert Gallatin as Secretary of State. He also cast an important tie-breaking vote that prevented the recharter of the First Bank of the United States. Clinton was the first vice president to die in office, as well as the first vice president to die overall. Clinton was the first of 2 vice presidents to serve in the position under 2 different presidents. His original burial was in Washington, D.C., at the Congressional Cemetery, but he was reinterred at the Old Dutch Churchyard in Kingston, New York in 1908. So, for almost 100 years, he was at the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C., but then he was reinterred to the Old Dutch Cemetery there, Churchyard in Kingston, New York. 1908 is when that happened. So, now just a couple quick fun facts about George Clinton. He unsuccessfully fought as brigadier general in the Revolutionary War, giving up Fort Clinton to a British general, Sir Henry Clinton. George Clinton was New York's first and longest-serving governor, holding the post for 22 years. And George Clinton engaged in a famous battle of wits with Alexander Hamilton. An opponent of the Constitution, he wrote 7 letters against ratification in the New York Journal, signing them Cato. Alexander Hamilton answered in a rival paper under the nom de plume of Caesar. Clinton also forged a political alliance with Aaron Burr, who of course made sure that Hamilton ultimately lost the real battle by killing him. Crazy stuff. Just trying to see if there's anything else that I can kind of tell you here. No, Revolutionary War, vice presidential candidate, death while in office. Clinton died while in office as Madison's vice president. It was on April 12th of 1812. I'm sorry, take that back. Clinton died while in office as Madison's vice president on April 20th of 1812. He was the first individual to lie in state in the U.S. Capitol. He was then buried at the Congressional Cemetery, and members of Congress also wore black armbands for 30 days after his death. His legacy? Clinton was a Revolutionary War hero who was immensely popular and important in early New York politics. He served as the vice president for 2 presidents. However, the fact that he was not consulted and did not truly affect any national politics while serving in this position helped set a precedent for an ineffectual vice president. Well, there you go, guys. George Clinton, our 4th vice president of the United States. There's a look at the life, the legacy, the vice presidency, and the death, and then the gravesite there in Kingston, New York, of George Clinton. Now, you will see some bonus footage of me visiting George Clinton's gravesite in Kingston, New York, and some other things there. I have not been to where he was originally interred at Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. I've been to the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. However, I've never seen the actual plot where George Clinton originally was. To be honest with you, I'm not even sure that it even still is around. I don't even know if there's even a marker or anything that indicates that, to be completely honest with you. I could be wrong, though. There might have been some sort of holding vault or something that he was in for close to 100 years there at the Congressional Cemetery. I'm not really sure. I'll look into that a little further. But there you go, guys. There is the life, legacy, death, burial, gravesite, all that of our 4th Vice President of the United States, George Clinton. So stay tuned now. Next week, of course, we're going to be taking a look at the 5th Vice President of the United States, who is Elbridge Gerry. Elbridge Gerry is, Jerry, is a very interesting person. He's actually the only person buried, vice president or otherwise, there in the Congressional Cemetery, still in Washington, D.C. So some interesting stuff about him you'll find out next week. So stay tuned. So I appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for everything that you guys have done. And keep it coming. Keep all the support, the questions, the comments. We love it. And stay tuned. A lot happening for this channel over the next couple of months. Like I said, maybe merchandise. Maybe a Patreon's on the way. A new logo. All sorts of things are on the horizon. So stay tuned. There you go, guys. I appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed this look at George Clinton, our 4th Vice President of the United States. Next week, Elbridge Gerry. And there you have it. Thanks, guys. See you next week. Hey guys, so I actually wanted to add this little clip in, this feature, little bonus for you guys. Something I had read kind of afterwards, and I found it to be extremely interesting. It's, of course, a fact about George Clinton, the 4th Vice President of the United States, of course. And it's in regards to the very famous Declaration of Independence painting by John Trumbull. It's actually the painting you're seeing here on your screen. Very famous painting. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that before. Interestingly enough, George Clinton was depicted in this painting, the Declaration of Independence painting by John Trumbull. But George Clinton, he neither signed or was even present when it was signed, meaning the Declaration of Independence. So even though George Clinton is depicted in here, He wasn't actually present when the document was signed, and he also did not sign the declaration. And I'm going to read you some stuff that I found. The founding of the United States of America was certainly not the pretty picture John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence leads the viewer to believe. As a matter of fact, more specifically, the events surrounding the Declaration of Independence had very little resemblance to this now very famous painting. Interestingly enough. So just to I'm kind of skipping ahead a little bit, just to read here for you guys. It is often assumed that Declaration of Independence, the painting, depicts the signing of the Declaration of Independence, an event which began on August 2nd, but continued for months as delegates arrived in or returned to Philadelphia. It could be also be assumed that the painting depicts July 4th, which is Independence Day. However, in actuality, it is meant to depict the events of June 28th of 1776, when the Committee of Five, which is from left to right, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert R. Livingston, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, presented their draft of the Declaration of Independence to President John Hancock and Congress. John Trumbull began work on the Declaration of Independence painting while in Paris a decade after the Declaration of Independence. His painting was based in part on conversations with his friend Thomas Jefferson, who was then in Paris as U.S. Minister to France. The Yale University Art Gallery has Jefferson and Trumbull's initial sketches of the assembly room, though Jefferson misremembered certain details. But John Trumbull also took creative license based on the likeness available to him. Declaration of Independence includes 42 of the 56 signers, as well as several men who did not sign, for a total of 47 portraits. 36 of these portraits were taken from life, and the others were copied from existing portraits or from relatives. Though Trumbull worked on the painting for years in hopes of including all of the signers, the lesser-known delegates and the ones who died in the years just after the Declaration of Independence was signed did not make the cut. Both Jefferson and Adams apparently advised Trumbull that in cases where no portraits could be found to copy, the delegates should be left out rather than poorly represented. After decades of work, John Trumbull was commissioned to produce a monumental version of his Declaration of Independence for the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. He completed the painting by 1818, and it was installed in the rotunda with his other monumental works in 1826. So who was actually present in Congress on June 28th of 1776? In his Letters of Members of the Continental Congress, published in 1921, Edmund C. Burnett listed the attendance dates of delegates based on clues in correspondence as well as the journals of the Continental Congress. Based on his work, the following men were more than likely in Independence Hall on June 28th of 1776. And I'm not going to go through every one of them, but President John Hancock, Secretary Charles Thompson, and then it gives state by state. Now, when we get to New York, it has John Alsop, George Clinton, William Floyd, Francis Lewis, Robert R. Livingston, and Henry Wisner. So, there you go. 44 men, excluding Secretary Thompson. Only 34 of the men who were present on June 28th when the Declaration of Independence was presented to Congress would subsequently sign the engrossed parchment on or after August 2nd. Of the 43 delegates present on June 28th, only 31 made it into Trumbull's painting. So, there you go. Interestingly enough, supplemental images of delegates not included by Trumbull, courtesy of New York Public Library's digital collections, include Morton, Stone, Nelson, Lee, Braxton, Penn, Gwinnett, Hall, and Alsop. We have followed Adams and Jefferson's advice and excluded 3 delegates rather than including poor representations of them. So it's pretty interesting. And then a little further it reads, John Alsop, George Clinton, and Henry Wisner of New York, they were present on June 28th, those 3 men. They did not sign the Declaration of Independence. Pictured is George Clinton. Not pictured in Trumbull's painting is Alsop and Wisner. These 3 delegates were present for the debates and vote for independence, but abstained from voting. George Clinton, who would later serve as vice president under Jefferson, post-Burr, and Madison, left shortly after July 4th. He was recalled to the New York headquarters of the Continental Army by General George Washington. Alsop resigned on July 16th, and Wisner left Congress about the same time, taking his seat in the New York Assembly on July 23rd. So, there you go. That's a little bit about the George Clinton being depicted in that very famous John Trumbull painting of the Declaration of Independence. So really, that is not a depiction of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That is more a depiction of the meeting when the first draft was being presented to the Continental Congress on June 28th of 1776. So even though Clinton never signed the Declaration, and he never actually really was there when it was signed, still he would have been there on June 28th of 1776. So the John Trumbull painting is more accurate than people actually think, based upon when it was really trying to depict. But I found that really interesting, and I thought that was a cool little note here for in everything. Oh, by the way, in errors in calculation and in the description of John Alsop, George Clinton, and Henry Wisner, June rather than July have been corrected. Yeah, I think it said July, but it's actually June. So, yeah, this pretty interesting, pretty fascinating, very well researched too. This was actually on harvard.edu, where I found this article relating to this John Trumbull depiction. So, good stuff. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I definitely wanted to add that in, though. Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye. Hey, guys. TJ here with Dead History. And that sign right there, I'm going to flip you around and show you what that is and where I'm at. So I am actually at, this is the entrance to the estate that was owned by Vice President George Clinton. It was occupied from 1804 to 1812 by George Clinton, who was then the Vice President of the United States. You can see this old wall and this old gate. Now the property no longer exists. The estate, the actual building, is long gone. But you know, this gate and this sign that I just showed you is here. But pretty cool. So this is in Wappinger Falls. I don't know if it's Wappinger or Wappinger. I think it's Wappinger Falls, New York. It's kind of upstate New York, but not far upstate. We're only about 40 minutes from New York City, so but pretty cool. So yeah, this was the former grounds and the site of the estate that George Clinton, Vice President, lived at. Pretty cool stuff. Just wanted to show you guys this. I found it pretty fascinating. Like I said, we gotta take what we can get when it comes to these vice presidents, because there's just not much out there regarding them. So pretty cool stuff. Here I get a little shot here of the sign and the gate. There you go. Thanks, guys. Hello, so my name is TJ Fallon, and welcome to Dead History. This is actually my son Henry right here. He's with me on our little adventure today, and we're actually standing in Kingston, New York, and that is a statue behind me of the 4th Vice President of the United States, George Clinton, who was also the very first governor of the state of New York. He holds the distinction of being one of only 2 men to be vice president under 2 different presidents. He was vice president under Thomas Jefferson, and he was vice president under James Madison. So, very cool stuff. I just wanted to introduce ourselves. You know, Henry and he'll probably be with me on some of my journeys, of course. But this channel is basically going to be dedicated to just what the title of it says, Dead History. So, I actually spent the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, traveling all over the United States of America via a car by myself with no one with me, and I actually traveled and saw every presidential gravesite with the exception of 2, every vice presidential gravesite with the exception of technically 1, and every Declaration of Independence signers gravesite. But outside of just gravesites, this goes a lot further. I mean, I stop at places like this and see some really cool forgotten things that, you know, people don't even know are right around the corner from their homes, or they just simply don't care. It's just kind of unspoken and forgotten history. So not only is Dead History kind of a play on words about the fact that I'll be visiting grave sites, it's also the plain simple fact of it's truly dead history. It's kind of dead and forgotten and gone, and I would love to kind of bring it back a little bit. Of course, there's not gonna be a revolution or a hashtag to go out there and see all these grave sites or anything like that, but you know, if I could shed some light on some of these men and women who are just forgotten and did some wonderful things for our country, then I would love to be able to do so. So just a brief introduction. We're actually going to be doing a couple things today. It's actually Halloween of 2020, which in this crazy 2020 has been kind of rare, right, buddy?
Yeah.
Been kind of rare this year, so we're driving around a little bit here in upstate New York, and probably stop at a couple places and show you guys today, but be on the lookout. There's going to be a lot of videos to come. I think my first series of videos is going to be, I'm just going to go in order, starting with George Washington, and show you guys the presidential grave sites, and then we'll kind of go from there, and I'll see what the reception's like. So any questions, please feel free to email me, contact me through the YouTube channel. I'd be happy to answer anything. And again, my name's TJ Fallon. I'm from New Jersey. I forgot to mention that. I'm born and raised in New Jersey, so I'm a Jersey boy. I'm 40 years old, divorced dad. Got a son here, Henry. He's 7, and he just turned 7. So we both enjoy doing this stuff and seeing this great history. So signing off for now, but thanks for stopping by and checking out the page, and I hope everybody really enjoys it. Say bye, buddy. Bye-bye. And at the end of each video, I think I'm going to leave by saying, now belongs to the ages. And we are back, TJ with Dead History, here with Henry, and we're actually at the gravesite of George Clinton, the statue that we just went and saw here in Kingston, New York. This is George Clinton's gravesite. He, like I said, was the 4th Vice President of the United States under both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, so pretty cool. Beautiful old church. And just, it's a really beautiful, quaint town of Kingston. I actually did a presentation for a couple universities in New Jersey, and George Clinton actually made my top 5 of my favorite vice presidential grave sites. So it's really just very quaint. I really like it. So this is George Clinton, and Dead History here. TJ with Henry, signing off for now. We will see you soon. And again, now he belongs to the ages.